All right, guys, welcome back to yet another episode of the Blueprint Podcast, the number one podcast when it comes to the building blocks of mindset, personal growth, dating and relationships, business, fitness, anything that you need to know to become a fulfilled human being to grow to the fullest extent that you can grow. And today I want to talk about the subject of boundaries. I want to talk about something that every person at some point in time has to deal with, and a lot of us also struggle with. And so, the reason why I decided to go for this specific subject is because something that I've been struggling with for a long time as well. Because depending on how you grew up as a child, like a single mother household, or your parents constantly fighting, or not having any parents at all, we develop these attachment styles. And these attachment styles have a huge impact on how we perceive the world, more specifically, how we perceive and go through intimate relationships. And a big part of that is like how we deal with conflict. And so if you're a person who feels like, they don't really understand who they are and how to set healthy boundaries, then this specific episode is one that you definitely want to hear out. So, let's start by defining boundaries. Like, what are boundaries in the first place? In the most simple terms, boundaries just like the invisible line that separates what's mine from yours, right? In the reality, a boundary could be, a boundary between countries or whatever. In a relationship, it means the invisible line in which we feel comfortable to tolerate certain behaviors or to not tolerate certain behaviors, right? So if any person that you're dealing with is violating things that make you feel uncomfortable, then there is a need for you to vocalize that, to communicate that. However, a lot of the problems that I notice when it comes to setting healthy boundaries is, first and foremost, we don't know what those boundaries are, right? And that brings me to the very first step. Like, how do you define boundaries in the first place? Well, it is by having a sense of understanding of who you are. And so everybody is kind of like the sum of an X amount of values, right? We have values in our lives that we, kind of like try to live up to, that we try to convey to the world, the things that we're trying to communicate. And they're established very often in our roots, where we're coming from, the way we grew up, etc. However, we don't really go about it in a very explicit and rational way. We rarely tend to reflect on what that value system actually is. And not only that, a lot of the values over time, they change, because if you're doing it right as a person, you're evolving, and so are your values. And so everybody has a hierarchy of values, right? Like, you can actually prioritize them if you think about it. And so, for example, if you're a person who always used to be extremely career driven, your number one value may have been ambition. You may have never really thought about it like that, but if you would have to write it down, if you were to take a piece of paper and a pen and you were to have it written down, maybe ambition would have been your number one value. But as time goes by, you get into a relationship and maybe you're about to have your very firstborn child. And the moment you're holding that child for the first time, that value system may be reordered from, ambition taking up the first place to family taking up the first place, right? So you have to understand who you are as a person in any given area at any given time, right? And so a lot of people, they never really take the moment to just reflect, to take inventory of those things. And therefore, they don't even know what they're actually okay with and what they're not okay with. And I remember that even in my personal relationships, this is something that I struggled with because, I grew up without a dad, like I already mentioned many times before. And therefore, I also felt like there were a lot of things of which I really wasn't certain if they were okay or not. It's certain behaviors, certain things that were different from my culture, etc. And so it was only when I really started to take inventory of that started to change, that I started to have like a better sense of the things that I was okay with and that I wasn't okay with. And so, when it comes to relationships, you have to learn what your limits are. And if you cannot define what your limits are, then how do you expect to communicate those things, right? So healthy boundaries, they're extremely essential because they allow us to protect our emotional and physical and mental well-being, right? It's very often in the most literal sense. And so if you want to avoid the feeling of resentment, the feeling of being drained, the feeling of you feeling like a weak individual because you don't have the fucking balls to stand up for what you want and to communicate that, then obviously, it's gonna take a mental toll. And, the second thing that I want to point out is that very often when it comes to dealing with conflict, all of us, we have this tendency of coming from a place of blame, right? We want to point out what the other person is doing wrong, but a much healthier way that opens up the space, like a safe space for both to communicate about the issue at hand, is instead of pointing the finger and telling them what they are doing wrong, is pointing the finger at yourself and just explaining how things make you feel, right? So trying to come from the I perspective, in which you, for example, state something like, I feel comfortable when XYZ happens. I feel uncomfortable when people treat me in a certain way. And then that way, you allow the other person to fill up your shoes and just see from your perspective what is going on, because the likelihood of them feeling attacked just decreases so much. And so instead of them immediately jumping into that defensive mode, maybe you're opening up the space for them to just see what's going on from your eyes, from your perspective, right? And so obviously, I say this as if it's really easy, but it is a very difficult thing to do, because when you're in a conflict, emotions usually have the tendency of taking the upper hand, right? So you have to look for ways to, stay calm and just explain what you're going through and what you're feeling. And by the way, this is regardless of gender. This is not something that only women do or men do. Like, if you're a person who doesn't know how to communicate a healthy boundary, you are going to suffer, not only in your intimate relationships, but also your professional and business relationships, and also your family and friendships. So this is an extremely vital skill. I really do think it's a skill that we all need to practice, that we all need to understand. Now, once you have figured out basically what your value system is, what your needs are, because everybody has different needs, right? Everybody has needs that go so deep, they run so deep that we're willing to forsake virtually everything else to meet those needs. Hell, why do you think the junkie wants drugs so bad, even to the extent that they're willing to forsake their values for it, that they're willing to steal money from their parents or whatever? It's because the need really runs through their subconscious mind. It's so deep ingrained in their system that they're willing to sacrifice anything else for it. Now, obviously, this is an extreme example, but the point that I'm trying to make is that everybody has a certain set of needs, and some of them really go that deep that we're willing to go to the extremes to get those needs met. But the good news is that we don't have to go to those extremes if we know how to communicate properly what those needs are. So taking inventory again of what we want, what we need, how we like to be loved. I already spoke on this. Like, everybody has their own love languages. And again, we often have this tendency, and I've been guilty of this myself, to speak from our perspective, to communicate and translate from our language, and instead of trying to speak the language of the other person. So understanding what those needs are, that obviously is a big part of it. But now that you have a clear understanding of who you are and what those boundaries are, how are you going to maintain them? Like, what's the next step? What's the next missing puzzle piece? Well, again, it boils down to understanding how you can communicate, how you cannot come from a place of blame. And I think one of the worst feelings that I remember in my own personal intimate relationships, the number one feeling that I probably despise the most, it's resentment. It's when you have things inside of you that are left unsaid, whether that is, during the relationship or very often after a breakup, right? You break up with someone and there's so many things that are left unsaid, and it just it boils inside you. And I think one of the reasons why we feel resentment in the first place, not only towards the other person, but also towards ourselves, because we ourselves feel like weak individuals when we're not able to vocalize our wants, our needs. It just like it gets to a point in which we really start to become like bitter human individuals, right? If you ever look around and you see those people that are always bitter, it's probably because they have a lot of things left unsaid, right? There's so many things that happen to them and they were never really able to communicate that in a healthy way, that it's still there inside, right? And so resentment is just probably my least favorite emotion, because for me, I also associate it with weakness. When I think of resentment, and the reason I associate it with weakness is because I feel like we were lacking the backbone. We didn't have the backbone to just say what we wanted to say, to speak out, to stand up for ourselves, right? And so maintaining the healthy boundaries is first and foremost by occasionally taking the inventory that I was just talking earlier about, right? To keep, checking by journaling or whatever, like understanding who you are as a person and getting to know yourself better. And therefore also being able to cut off the bullshit, to not tolerate things that you don't want to tolerate. And, I always say it's always best to leave the place with grace when people are violating those boundaries, right? So instead of getting angry and all worked up about it, you just say, look, this is what I'm willing to accept. This is how far you can go. And if that's not okay with you, or that's not your prerogative, or that's not how you operate, fine by me. But then I decide here and now that our ways are going to separate. Wish you nothing but the best, but I'm going to leave this place with grace. Right? And so learning to match your actions basically and map them with what you want is basically the way forward in creating and maintaining those healthy boundaries. Now, I know that this is a very difficult subject, so if you have more questions about it, feel free to reach out on Instagram, on DM, if you're going through any situation. For now, in the next coming weeks, I'm going to give you free advice, free guidelines in whatever you're going through. I'm not going to keep doing this. I'm going to charge money for it at some point, but from now on, for the rest of the month of February, if you have anything that you're dealing with, especially regarding the subjects of my podcast, feel free to reach out on my DMs. Maybe it takes some time to reply because I'm doing a shit ton of things at the same time, and there's also a lot of messages from people that I get on a daily basis. But I promise you that I will get back to you. And for my part, I just want to ask anything that you can do to support this podcast, whether that is here on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, like whatever platform that you're using. I really need you guys to hit that subscribe button. And the only thing that I'm asking is only if it gave you any value. If you think that this is a shit podcast, if you don't like it, if you feel like it's a waste of your time, please don't listen to me. Don't look at me. Don't listen to me. I don't want to waste your time. I want to bring value. I understand that my message is not going to resonate with everybody. Maybe my style of speaking is not going to resonate with everybody. That's fine. But if you got any value out of this, please hit the subscribe button, give it a like, share it with your friends. It helps me. I really need this stuff because it's hard to grow a channel like this, and I just want to reach more people and help more people, right? So thank you. And in the meantime, as usual, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy. Let's get it.